World War I is often remembered through sepia-toned photographs of men in trenches, through poetry about sacrifice, through monuments that speak of duty and honor. But there is another story beneath that one. A story about how 4 years of industrial slaughter rewired the way governments, generals, and doctors thought about human beings. This is not about bravery. This is about what happens when life becomes a resource to be managed, counted, and disposed of according to logistical necessity. What follows are facts that were documented, then buried. Facts that reveal how the Great War didn't just kill millions, it turned killing into a system. In the summer of 1914, when the war began, European powers believed it would be over by Christmas. They were correct about one thing: it would be decisive, but not in the way they imagined. What they built instead was a machine that ran on bodies. And once it was running, no one knew how to turn it off. The Western Front became a line of fortified positions stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 440 miles of trench systems, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery parks. For 4 years, that line barely moved. Men died by the hundreds of thousands to capture a few hundred yards of ground. Then they died by the hundreds of thousands to lose it again. The movement was so minimal that generals began measuring success not in territory gained, but in enemy casualties inflicted. They called it attrition. The goal was not to win ground. The goal was to kill more of them than they killed of you. Human life became a unit of exchange. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties on the first day. 19,000 of those men were dead. That remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. The attack had been planned for months. The commanders believed that a week-long artillery bombardage would destroy the German defenses and allow the infantry to walk across no man's land unopposed. The bombardment fired over 1.5 million shells. It could be heard in London, but when the infantry went over the top at 7:30 in the morning on July 1st, the German machine gunners were waiting. They had survived in deep bunkers. The British soldiers advanced in waves, walking slowly because they carried 60 to 70 pounds of equipment. They were told not to run. The officers believed discipline and formation mattered more than speed. The Germans simply aimed their guns at the gaps in the barbed wire and fired. Men fell in rows. The attack continued for 4.5 months. By the time it ended in November, the British and French had suffered over 600,000 casualties. The Germans lost nearly 500,000. The Allies gained 6 miles of ground. That works out to 1 life lost for every 10 inches of territory. Commanders considered the battle a success because German losses were high. The math had replaced the men. What made the Somme possible was not courage. It was paperwork. The British Army had developed a system for processing casualties that was more efficient than anything previously attempted in warfare. Wounded men were tagged, categorized, and moved through a network of aid posts, casualty clearing stations, and base hospitals according to the severity of their injuries. The system was designed to return men to the front as quickly as possible. Soldiers with minor wounds were treated in forward areas and sent back within days. Those with moderate injuries went to clearing stations and could be returned within weeks. Only the most severely wounded were evacuated to Britain. The goal was not healing. The goal was recycling. Medical officers were evaluated based on how many men they returned to duty. A doctor who evacuated too many soldiers could be reprimanded for waste. The human body had become inventory. Shell shock was not officially recognized as a medical condition by the British Army until 1917, 3 years into the war. Before that, men who broke down mentally were often treated as cowards or malingerers. Some were court-martialed, some were executed. The symptoms were unmistakable: uncontrollable shaking, inability to speak, paralysis without physical cause, nightmares so severe that men refused to sleep. But the military command structure could not afford to acknowledge that the war itself was driving men insane, because if they did, the entire logic of attrition would collapse. If High Command admitted that prolonged exposure to industrial bombardment and trench warfare caused permanent psychological damage, they would have to admit that their strategy was unsustainable. So instead, they created a distinction. Officers who broke down were said to be suffering from neurasthenia, a nervous condition caused by overwork. Enlisted men who exhibited the same symptoms were said to be suffering from lack of moral fiber. Officers were sent to rest homes. Enlisted men were sent back to the front. The difference was not medical, it was administrative. By 1917, the British Army had executed 306 of its own soldiers for cowardice, desertion, or disobedience. Some of these men were teenagers. Some had been in continuous combat for years. Some showed clear signs of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But the military justice system operated on the principle that fear was a choice. A man could choose to obey or choose to disobey. If he disobeyed, he was shot. The executions were carried out by firing squad, usually at dawn, often in view of the condemned man's own unit. This was deliberate. The purpose was deterrence. The logic was simple. If men feared execution more than they feared the enemy, they would continue to fight. And it worked. Mutinies were rare on the Western Front. Men kept going over the top. The system had made dying easier than refusing. The French army executed around 600 of its own men during the war, though the exact number is disputed because records were destroyed or classified. In 1917, after the failure of the Nivelle offensive, which cost 120,000 French casualties in less than 2 weeks, entire units began to refuse orders. The mutinies spread across 54 divisions. The men were not surrendering to the Germans. They were not fleeing. They were simply refusing to attack. They would defend their positions. They would hold the line. But they would not take part in another suicidal offensive. The French High Command responded with mass arrests. Thousands of soldiers were court-martialed. The executions were selective. Officers chose men at random from mutinous units and had them shot as examples. The mutinies ended. The attacks resumed. The official history recorded it as a restoration of discipline. What it actually demonstrated was that the war had become self-enforcing. Men were more afraid of their own side than of the enemy. Trench foot was a medical condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. The feet would swell, turn numb, then begin to rot. In severe cases, amputation was necessary. It was entirely preventable. All it required was regular removal of wet socks, drying of feet, and application of grease. But in many sectors of the front, conditions made this impossible. Trenches flooded with rainwater mixed with sewage, decomposing bodies, and chemical runoff from shell craters. Men stood in this for days or weeks at a time. By 1915, trench foot had become so widespread that the British Army issued an order making it a disciplinary offense. If an officer's unit had too many trench foot cases, he could be charged with neglect. The reasoning was that trench foot indicated poor leadership. The effect was that officers began underreporting cases. Men with early-stage trench foot were kept in the line rather than evacuated because evacuation would reflect poorly on the officer's record. The condition worsened. More amputations became necessary. The army had turned a preventable injury into a command performance metric. Rats in the trenches grew to the size of cats. They fed on corpses, on rations, on anything organic. There were two kinds, brown rats and black rats. The brown ones were bigger. Soldiers reported seeing them swarm over sleeping men, biting their faces and hands. Poison was ineffective because the rats had an unlimited food supply. Shooting them was prohibited in many areas because it wasted ammunition and could draw enemy fire. Some units organized rat hunts with clubs and bayonets. They killed hundreds in a single night. By morning, more had arrived. The rats became part of the landscape. Men stopped trying to eliminate them and simply coexisted. One British officer recorded in his diary that he woke one night to find a rat sitting on his chest, staring at him. He stared back. Neither moved. He wrote that he no longer knew which of them was the intruder. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had them. They lived in the seams of uniforms and fed on blood. The itching was constant and maddening. Men would sit for hours running a candle flame along the seams of their clothing, trying to burn the lice out. It never worked. The eggs survived. Within days, the infestation returned. Some soldiers gave up and accepted it. The lice caused trench fever, a debilitating illness with symptoms including high fever, headache, and severe pain in the legs and back. It could incapacitate a man for weeks. The British Army lost hundreds of thousands of man-days to trench fever. There was no cure. The only prevention was delousing, which required removing men from the front, stripping them, boiling their clothes, and shaving their bodies. This took time and resources. High Command considered it an inefficient use of both, so men stayed lousy, and the fever spread. The discomfort was accepted as a cost of operations. Gas attacks were introduced by the Germans at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. The first attack used chlorine gas released from cylinders when the wind was favorable. The gas drifted across no man's land in a green-yellow cloud. Men who inhaled it experienced burning in the throat and lungs, vomiting and suffocation. Those who survived often suffered permanent lung damage. The Allies responded by developing their own chemical weapons. Phosgene, mustard gas, each more effective than the last. Mustard gas caused blistering of the skin, blindness, and internal burns. It soaked into clothing and could cause injuries hours after exposure. It pooled in shell craters and low-lying areas, making them lethal traps. By the end of the war, both sides had fired millions of shells containing chemical agents. The gas killed approximately 90,000 soldiers and injured over 1 million. But the real significance was not the casualties. It was the precedent. Chemical weapons proved that if a method increased efficiency, it would be used, regardless of its nature. The war had become indifferent to the type of suffering it caused. Artillery was responsible for more deaths than any other weapon in World War I. Estimates suggest that up to 70% of all casualties were caused by shellfire. The psychological impact was worse than the physical. A man in a trench had no control over whether he lived or died during a bombardment. He could dig deeper, stay low, and pray. That was all. Shells arrived without warning. One moment, there was silence. The next, the ground erupted. The blast could kill through concussion alone, rupturing internal organs without leaving a visible wound. Shrapnel could decapitate, dismember, or shred a man into pieces so small that nothing remained to bury. Men learned to recognize the different sounds: the whistle of an incoming shell, the crump of a distant explosion, the shriek of a near miss. They learned to count the seconds between sound and impact, calculating whether they had time to take cover. They learned that sometimes there was no time, and they learned that this could go on for hours, or days, or weeks. The Verdun offensive in 1916 saw artillery bombardments that lasted for months. Men lived underground, emerging only when the shelling paused. Some never emerged. They were buried alive when their dugouts collapsed. The ground at Verdun was so saturated with metal that it remains toxic over a century later. Trees do not grow in certain areas. The soil is still full of shrapnel and unexploded shells. The concept of going over the top entered the language because of World War I. It referred to the moment when soldiers climbed out of their trench and advanced across no man's land toward the enemy. This was the most dangerous thing a soldier could be asked to do. Machine guns could fire up to 600 rounds per minute. A single gun could cover a wide area. Men advancing in the open had no cover and limited ability to return fire while moving. The result was predictable. Casualties were heaviest in the first few minutes of an attack. Officers knew this. They planned for it. Attack orders included casualty estimates. A commander might be told to expect 40% losses in the first wave. This was considered acceptable if the attack achieved its objective. And if it did not, the attack would be repeated with fresh troops. The math was simple. Men were abundant. Time was limited. Therefore, spending men to save time was logical. The equation had no room for the men themselves. Soldiers were not told where they were going or what the overall strategy was. Information was compartmentalized. A private knew his squad's objectives. A sergeant might know the platoons, a lieutenant might know the companies, but no one below the rank of colonel had a complete picture of the operation. This was partly for security, but mostly for control. If men did not know the strategic situation, they could not question the orders. They could not refuse based on the futility of the task. They could only obey. And they did. They climbed out of the trenches and walked into machine gun fire because the alternative was a firing squad. Some units suffered 90% casualties in a single day and were reformed with replacements and sent back into the line within a week. The institutional memory of the slaughter lasted only as long as the survivors, and the survivors were always being replaced. Soldiers who survived long enough developed a fatalism that disturbed officers and chaplains. They stopped caring whether they lived or died. They performed their duties mechanically, without hope or fear. Letters home became shorter and emptier. Men stopped making plans for after the war. They stopped talking about the future. They existed in a permanent present, where the only certainty was that the war would continue and most of them would not survive it. Some welcomed death as a release. Others simply waited. This psychological state was so common that it stopped being remarked upon. It became the norm. The war had produced a generation of men who had learned to live without attachment to their own lives. The practice of recovering bodies from no man's land was abandoned in many sectors because it was too dangerous. Corpses lay where they fell, sometimes for months. They decomposed in the open. Rain and shelling churned them into the mud. Soldiers walked on ground that contained fragments of human remains. They dug trenches and found bones. They used corpses as building materials, stacking them into trench walls because sandbags were in short supply. This was not done out of cruelty. It was done out of necessity, and necessity had redefined what was acceptable. The living and the dead occupied the same space, and the boundary between them had become administrative rather than moral. The phrase cannon fodder predates World War I, but the war gave it literal meaning. Soldiers were fed into battles the way coal is fed into a furnace. The metaphor was not lost on the men. They used it themselves. They referred to their units as meat for the grinder. They joked that the generals were playing a game and they were the pieces. The jokes were not funny. They were coping mechanisms. Humor became a tool for processing the unprocessable, and the fact that men could joke about their own expendability revealed how completely they had internalized it. They knew they were disposable. The system had taught them, and they had learned. Replacement soldiers arriving at the front in 1917 and 1918 often had less than 6 months of training. Some had less than 3. The demand for manpower exceeded the capacity to train it. Men were taught to march, shoot, and obey orders, then shipped to the front. They arrived with no understanding of trench warfare, no experience with gas attacks, no knowledge of how to survive. Veteran soldiers stopped learning their names. They called them replacements or fresh fish. The turnover was too high to justify forming attachments. A replacement might be dead within days or even hours of arrival. Some died before they reached the front line, killed by random shell fire while moving up to the trenches. Their names were recorded, their families notified, and the system requested more replacements. The process was industrial. Medical advances during World War I were significant, but they were not driven by a desire to reduce suffering. They were driven by a desire to return men to combat. Blood transfusions became routine because they kept men alive long enough to be sent back to the front. Surgical techniques improved because faster surgery meant higher throughput at casualty clearing stations. Prosthetics were developed not to improve quality of life for amputees, but to reduce the pension burden on the state. A man with an artificial leg could work and therefore did not require full disability payments. The war produced innovations in trauma care that saved millions of lives in the decades that followed. But in the context of the war itself, those innovations existed to sustain the killing. By 1918, entire villages in France had been obliterated. Not damaged, obliterated. The ground where they had stood was cratered and poisoned. Stone foundations were pulverized. Wells were contaminated. The land was unusable. After the war, the French government designated certain areas as Zone Rouge. Red zone, where human habitation was permanently forbidden due to contamination and unexploded ordnance. Some of these areas remain off-limits today. The war had made parts of Europe uninhabitable. It had achieved what no previous conflict had achieved. It had rendered the Earth itself dead. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed more people than the war, but it spread as fast and as far as it did because of the war. Troop movements carried the virus across continents. Crowded troop ships and barracks provided ideal conditions for transmission. Weakened immune systems from malnutrition and stress made soldiers especially vulnerable. The pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. It was a direct consequence of the conditions the war created. The war had killed beyond the battlefield. It had killed through the systems it required to sustain itself. When the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, fighting stopped at 11 in the morning, but men continued to die right up until that moment. Some were killed in attacks launched minutes before the ceasefire. Some commanders ordered final assaults to capture objectives that would be meaningless in a few hours. The last British soldier killed in action died at 10:58, 2 minutes before the war ended. His name was George Edwin Ellison. The last French soldier died at 10:50, the last Canadian at 10:58, the last American at 10:59. They died because the war had not yet officially ended. The clock mattered more than their lives. The final casualty count for World War I is unknowable. Military deaths are estimated at around 10 million. Civilian deaths are estimated at another 10 million, though some sources place the number much higher. Millions more died from disease and famine caused by the war. The numbers are so large that they lose meaning. 10 million is not a number the human mind can process as individual lives. It becomes a statistic. And that is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the war. It taught governments and militaries that mass death could be managed, quantified, and justified. It established that human life could be measured in units and expended according to strategic calculus. It proved that populations would accept this if the narrative was properly controlled. After the war, monuments were built, speeches were given, the dead were honored. But the systems that had killed them remained. The bureaucracies that had processed them as units of attrition were not dismantled. The command structures that had ordered them into machine gun fire were preserved. The logic that had treated them as disposable was refined and applied to the next war. World War I did not end the idea of mass sacrifice. It normalized it. The war demonstrated that industrial societies could organize the deaths of millions and continue functioning. It proved that the machinery of slaughter could operate indefinitely as long as the supply of men held out. When the war ended, the factories that had produced shells began producing automobiles. The officers who had planned offensives went home and wrote memoirs. The systems persisted. The war had been the proof of concept. What it proved was that human life, when processed through modern institutions, could be made disposable not through cruelty or hatred, but through simple administrative efficiency. The war did not reveal a monster. It revealed a method, and the method survived the war intact.